It's really a pleasure to come around the table here, around the fireside, to have this conversation with all of you. I won't go through all the representation in the room, but this is one of our most diverse representations from the community. We have students here, we have teachers from local public high schools here, we have educators from universities and institutions, not only Yale, Gateway, and others, and we have a wonderful special guest who's in the room. Actually, just want to acknowledge one of our partners from Guangzhou, China. When they heard that Nancy Pine was going to speak on this topic, made sure to visit us today. Dean Xu Xizong, the head of Lingnan University College, and Professor Liu, his colleague. So Dean Xu is the head of Lingnan University College at Sun Yat-sen University, and he's doing, in his position in the last 4 or 5 years, has really transformed how the students are experiencing their institutional educational experience. And it's just an honor to have him here as well to listen to Nancy Pine's talks. We have so many wonderful guests. Thank you so much. This is our series called the Fireside Chat Series. We're very grateful to Shinzen Koradi, who makes these wonderful translator boxes. One lucky recipient will receive one at the end. It's a wonderful support to the work that we do. We try to bring the most interesting topics to the forefront and to this community. Most of our bread and butter is really on the ground in China. We've been running programs and institutions in China for about 113 years in education, in health, and the arts. Several of us will be in China next week for 2 weeks, in part to participate in the Shanghai Arts Festival. Yale-China is excited. We're looking at arts as a communication vehicle between the U.S. and China, between Americans and Chinese. So we're participating in that arts festival, as well as talking to a lot of potential partners in China to start up a Yale-China Arts Fellowship to complement our work in education and health. But today I really want to introduce Leslie Stone. Is our Director of Hong Kong and Director for Education Programs. She'll be moderating the discussion. She's the expert in-house for us. And also, just one bit of exciting news before I introduce Leslie is that Yale-China was just selected as one of 8 signature partners for the President Obama's initiative called 100,000 Strong. So we are one of 8 in the country to be a signature partner for this initiative that hopes to bring and increase the number of American students studying in China over the next several years. So we are very excited for that, and we are doing this program specifically at Metro Business Academy and New Haven Public High School, as well as Cooperative Arts and Humanities High School in New Haven. So we're delighted that we were able to be a part of that. You'll hear a lot more about that, as well as some press releases regarding that. But Leslie Stone, our formidable, the Director of Education, who really is the expert, and she'll do the honor of introducing Dr. Pine to all of us.
I'm going to stay seated, but if you have any trouble hearing me, just raise your hand and let me know. I have also the great honor of introducing Dr. Nancy Pine today. It's really, when I had heard that she was coming, I had not read her book, Educating Young Giants, and then have been just absolutely fascinated by this book. I truly recommend it to all of you. If you're interested in American education and Chinese education and comparing the two directly within the classroom, this is the book to read. Dr. Pine has been doing this research since the 80s. She was in the classrooms long before many people were thinking in this comparative way between the U.S. and China. She taught in public elementary schools for over 14 years, so she came with a lot of classroom experience and high school level too, so came from both levels. Her PhD is from Claremont Graduate University in Education, and she focused on learning in China and the United States. Her dissertation was called "A Comparison of Two Cultures' Complex Geographical Knowledge Prerequisite to Literacy," which actually meant she was looking at pre-writing and preschool,
That's right.
what young preschool children's approach to writing and learning writing from China and the U.S. Looking at the very youngest children and what cultural differences they had even at the very young age. She directed the elementary education program at Mount St. Mary's College in Los Angeles for 10 years and founded and directed Bridging Cultures U.S. and China program. And this book, Educating Young Giants, What Kids Learn and Don't Learn in China and America, is available for sale, and Dr. Pine will be here to sign copies for you if you wish to purchase one. We will hear a presentation for about 20 minutes from Dr. Pine, and then we will open up for questions and I hope a lively discussion. There's such a great deal of expertise in this room and knowledge, so I think this should be a very interesting session. So thank you so much.
Great. It's great to be here, and please, if you can, if I drop my voice, don't be shy about waving and saying you can't hear, please. Because sometimes I get enthusiastic about what I'm thinking about, and I drop my voice. So please let me know if you can't hear. I'm going to just speak for less than 20 minutes, I hope, and I want to give you some idea of the context from which I'm talking. So I have pictures of Chinese schools and also US schools, so you sort of have the idea of where I've been grounded. This is just to let you know, although I'm one European American woman sitting here, I have a lot of people sort of around me who are collaborators. Actually, the two groups at the top are both in rural schools. The ones in the bottom are actually primarily from the East Coast, and they're of China, and there are many more. But they've answered about 1,000 questions of mine, and they also ask a lot of questions of me. And of course, I have many American collaborators too. In the last few years, I have really focused part of my time on just understanding what we can learn from each other in the schools. What we can learn, what the American schools can learn from China, and what the Chinese schools can learn from the US educational system. I focus primarily on elementary grades because it's my belief that in fact that's where the patterns of education are set. So the style of learning that you have and that you sort of embed in your style of learning happens in the elementary grades, and then it carries on through junior high school and into college. And it's very culturally grounded, and many of the things that we learn to do, we're not aware that we're learning them, the way we interact. This is just to remind us that there is an issue of scale between China and the United States. This happens to be in a rural high school, and that's not all the students, but it just gives me a feeling of the fact that there are really a lot more students in China than there are here. So I'm going to focus on Chinese elementary schools first. This happens to be in a new village elementary school with new desks, a very special situation. In general, in China, and of course there's variety across China, and there's a lot of variety across the United States. So I tried to select pictures that are pretty emblematic of the general teaching, but there is variety everywhere. So in China, students are sit in rows almost entirely. In many classrooms, there's 60 to 70 children, not all of them, but there's not a lot of room to move around. The teacher is standing at the front of the room, generally. The teacher asks questions continuously, and in fact, classrooms are very often very loud. And so it's a teacher, student, teacher, all the students, teacher, student, teacher, student. It is not dull. I mean, there's a lot going on, but it's always the teacher asking the questions and the students answering. The students, for those of you who don't know, the students stand to speak. The teacher, they stand until the teacher tells them to sit down. And I also think this is the only picture this is the only child in China who has a hat on in a classroom. I'm not sure how that happened, but students often recite or read in unison. And part of this is related to memorization, but it's connected to a lot of other things too. It's connected to how you understand the text that you're reading. It helps the students who come with many different dialects improve their pronunciation of standard Chinese. And it also, of course, has a very long history in China. Unlike in the Western world, the Chinese have a history of reading orally. So if someone would like to read that in Chinese, you can go ahead. Team.
读书百遍，其义自见谅。
Very good. It's much better than I can do. And the fact is that if you read a book, if you read something 100 times, the meaning comes out more. And so this history, this is a long, long history. And so part of the oral reading that goes on in classrooms is also connected to this long history. Things to think about in Chinese education being different from US education is that the writing, of course, requires an enormous amount of precision and focus beginning in first grade or younger if we're going to start there. But by first grade, the children are focused in on learning to write characters, and it takes an enormous amount of concentration and focus, which does not happen when you're learning to write a Western language, which has 26 simple letters, and they don't have to be perfect. Whereas if you go to Chinese, every stroke has to be in the right place, and there are multiple strokes in every character. And of course, the characters also have to be balanced within that square. So that's something that Chinese children carry forward in their educational perspective from the beginning, which does not exist in the West at all. Students also learn advanced math, and it's much more advanced, I think we all know this, than US students. But I think, and there can be a lot said about this, but in fact, my belief is, having looked at lessons in both countries now for a long time, is that in fact the Chinese teach mathematical concepts from the very beginning, from first grade on. And American education tends to teach arithmetic processes, but are missing the conceptual big concepts that can be understood. So there is something else, and that is that, of course, China has numbers are everywhere. So there are lucky numbers, there are unlucky numbers. I happen to have a free telephone number because it has a lot of 4s in it, which is... I checked with my friends before I got it, because for those of you who don't know, that's not a good one because it sounds like the word for death, but the number 4. But this is a picture, this is very common, and to a Westerner, it just sort of stands out. This is a picture of the Forbidden City. It's just an absolutely common thing. And if you can't see it, the third sentence says, I'm looking, as the main part of the Imperial Ancestral Temple, it is 32.46 meters high and has a standard double-E-tip bay deep, 30.2 meters in width, standing on a 3-tiered white marble sumari, I just skipped a line, sorry, at 3.46 meters in height, and I can tell you that every American who's seen that has skipped that whole section because we just can't process that much detailed numeric information. Whereas in China, it's very commonplace. I mean, it's right there. It's sometimes on the first 2 or 3 sentences of a website for colleges. And it's just so numbers and numeric information is very much a part of everyday culture. And that is really not true here. Also, in the elementary schools, they learn lessons in depth and detail, and much more so than here. So they burrow down into the texts. They're not connecting it to their lives, but they're digging deeply into understanding what the writers have said. There is a big movement in China that's been going on for over 10 years to try to make classrooms much more student-friendly, to relate lessons to students' lives, and to use group work. And there's been minimal change. And I've had long discussions with teachers about how on earth you do group work and what it's for, and how you can connect things to children's lives. And there has been some movement. But there's something else that's really different, and these are the first teachers I ever met with at length, the first elementary school teachers I ever met with at length. And they taught me something very significant, which I had no idea about elementary education. I'm just going to read you a very brief part of my book. Catching my breath after a hair-raising ride through the crowded rush hour traffic, Gong, who was my interpreter, and I joined 15 teachers in the staff teaching room. We were in a school in northern Jiangsu province, and I was the first American who had ever been there. Gathered around a large table, our hands wrapped around ceramic cups of steaming tea to ward off the late winter chill, we began an energetic exchange. It was my first formal meeting with elementary school teachers in China. We had plenty in common. We were concerned about our students' progress. We wanted to give them the best learning opportunities possible. We shared the belief that to do so, we needed smaller classes and constant improvement of our skills. But as we talked, differences began to emerge. Where US teachers want classes to be kept to 30 students or less, the Suzhou teachers hope for fewer than their usual 60 or 70. They asked me to describe the responsibilities of their US counterparts. As I described what US elementary teachers do, a few began murmuring to each other, and for all of those who've been in interpretive situations, that begins to mean that nobody's understanding what's going on. So, the teacher whose class I'd observed the previous day asked me to explain again. An American elementary school teacher, I repeated, remains with the same class all day and is responsible for teaching all subjects. We teach reading, and this was in 1994, reading, writing, math, social science, science, health, art, and music. The children are with the same teacher all day. Again, they looked at each other, and several more began murmuring among themselves. The head teacher sitting beside me added hot water rather nervously to my cup and attempted to clarify what I had said. You teach all subjects then? All of them? Yes, I said, equally puzzled by their confusion. It finally dawned on me that these Suzhou elementary teachers did not teach all subjects to one class. I asked what they taught. The woman on my right said, I teach Chinese to the lower grades, what I think you call reading and writing. The next teacher said, I teach math. The next one, I'm the art teacher. And the next one, I teach Chinese to the upper grades, and I am the director of the class activities. And so it went around the table, specialist by specialist, describing their duties. Some taught 2 subjects, such as social science and calligraphy, but most taught only one. You teach those all day, I asked. How many periods? We teach 3 or 4 classes a day, depending on our other responsibilities, explained the head teachers. Stunned, I asked, what do you do the rest of the day? We plan with each other, work with students having difficulty, and grade papers. And she went on to describe the lengthy discussions they have about how to help students comprehend difficult concepts. They sometimes spend hours planning a single lesson or developing questions to ask their students that would help the children understand the challenging point. Anyway, their experience was so different from mine, I had a really hard time processing it. And it had never dawned on me that was a difference. And many people here certainly don't realize it. So there they were, the teacher of Chinese, the drawing teacher, the math teacher, and part of the time they spend observing each other and critiquing each other and collaborating. That's a very fundamental part of teaching in China, unlike here. So, jumping quickly to the U.S. schools very briefly, and there is a huge amount of variety in U.S. schools, but I've tried to select pictures that are pretty common across the country, even though there is big variety. So in elementary schools in the United States and also others, at other levels, students sit together in clusters. It gives them a chance to work together, to share materials, and it also gives space in the room to move around. The teachers often move around the classroom continuously. This teacher started at the front. She then went to the side where a student was talking who was very soft-spoken, and she wanted him to speak up, and then she ended up in the back. The focal point for the students in the classroom just shifts from whoever's talking, wherever that focal point should be. It doesn't bother them at all that there's this enormous amount of movement. One Chinese parent who had a 4th grade child in China, and so I had him observe in a classroom in Los Angeles, and he came out actually quite stunned himself, because he said his son had to spend every second of the 40-minute class on what the teacher was going to ask. He could never take his mind off what was said because of the rapid-fire questions and the fact that he was going to have to stand at some point and say it perfectly, whatever the question was. And he just said, your students get to relax. Well, some of us who teach think some of them relax a little too much, but they, in fact, he said they get to relax and they get a chance to think. And his feeling was that his son and their kids did not get that space that they needed to actually process information. So, for those of you who haven't been in U.S. schools, teachers often meet with just a group of students. So this is a 1st grade class. The students are, it's about 1/3 of the class. The rest of the students are either working independently or in pairs or small groups on tasks that the teacher has given them to work on. Then she will check back with them. So there's a lot of movement and there are rules in the classroom, but there's a lot of free movement and working independently. The walls in U.S. classrooms are used as teaching spaces. Children move around the room to use materials. And some of the comments I've gotten, I collect tons of comments from people in both countries, but many of the parents have just said that Chinese students never ask questions, and they just answer the teacher's questions. Whereas in the United States, students ask questions starting in kindergarten, and some of them never stop. In the United States, students work individually, in the classroom, individually, in pairs, and in groups, and they have a lot of time during the class period to work on things that the teacher has assigned to them, and then come back and share it in different ways. So in groups, the teacher often goes from table to table, answering questions, make sure they're on task, and making suggestions. And they're also very used to working together within a classroom setting. So, parental comments about education. The Chinese, one of the parents, and many more than one parent has said, Chinese teacher would never ask, what do you think? Whereas that's a very common thing that comes up in a classroom in the United States. Also, a number of Chinese parents who have been here in a classroom said, your kids get to do research projects from the beginning. And I thought, you know, I don't think of them as research projects going on in first grade, and I used to teach first grade. But it turns out they do little projects. They do an animal project, they do a bird project, and from the perspective of someone not from this culture, that's the beginning of research. And also that our students get an enormous, their options are always in front of them. Do you want to read this book or that book? Do you want to report on this president or that president? I mean, they're all, lots of choices all the time that I think we're not very aware of. The one thing I've learned about our schools by being in China is that our students, the whole teaching style and the student response style is improvisational. And so that there is nothing, a student may sort of take, from a Chinese parent's perspective, take a risk by giving an answer that's only partially right. They're sort of trying it out. And Chinese parents often say they're taking a tremendous risk doing that. But that's just sort of a standard way of behaving in US classrooms, because very often a student will give a partial answer and the teacher will say, can you add to that? Can you add to that? So that the responses become collective and collaborative. It's very, very different from the Chinese style of learning. In this short time, I'm obviously leaving out a huge amount, and I think, although lots of us would like to see a lot of the testing that has been imposed into the American schools removed, and a lot more creativity and innovation go on, in fact, compared to China, the US children are often encouraged to be very inventive. And I think, just in closing, we can basically say fundamentally that we want what the other person has, what the other country has. So Americans want really academically focused kids who are extremely good in math, and the Chinese want kids who ask a lot of questions and think innovatively. So, there you are. I'm looking forward to plenty of questions.
If it's okay, I'm going to start with the first question and then open things up for all the comments and questions from everyone here. But what is it that you think that most Americans misunderstand about Chinese education? And then on the other side, what is it that most Chinese misunderstand about American education?
Wow, that's a pretty interesting question.
So what are the most common
I think actually, yeah, we may get some comments from the from the audience too.
Yeah.
What Americans misunderstand about Chinese education? I think I could just take a piece of that, and I think if I look at mathematics, for instance, I think there are many people here who think that if we just do whatever the Chinese do, it's going to work here. And that's obviously not true, because we have really different cultures and different histories. And I think that leads me into the other thing that comes up when you ask that question, and that is that I think here we do not understand the history behind the Chinese educational system. And the focus that comes over thousands of years of exams, of memorization of texts, of all of that richness and tradition that carries into today's school systems in China. So I think that's probably the biggest piece. I mean, there are lots of other pieces. It's always hard to speak for another culture, but I think of the many Chinese I've spoken with, I think it's not so much a misunderstanding as a puzzlement about how we do things. So I have had long conversations in which, after a while, those of us who were from the outside say, you know, don't you need to go home for dinner? Because you know someone's there waiting for them, and they say, no, we need to have this conversation. Because many schools they're being asked to do things like group work in classrooms, and they have no idea what it would be useful for, how you would do it. I mean, there are actually ways of doing this kind of thing in packed classrooms where there isn't much space to move around. But there are ways actually to do it, because I've worked with people in schools and helped them learn how to do things, to have students collaborate. But it's a huge puzzle, and they just, they're frustrated because they're being told to do this. There are lectures telling them how. Sometimes when they get to a classroom where someone is sort of doing it in a way that seems reasonable, they do it, but it's just a big puzzle. And of course, the other question I get, and I'm not sure it's a misunderstanding, it's really a question. Whenever I give a lecture to a big group of people in China, one of the first questions that comes up is about discipline. And of course, we do have discipline issues in our classrooms, but at the same time, if you look at an American classroom and you don't understand that there are rules in that classroom, then it's very difficult to understand how it's functioning. So that when our kids are up and around getting pieces of paper or going and talking to another student, there are rules that they understand. If they go past a certain point, that teacher has eyes in the back of his or her head and knows exactly what's going on and says, sit down, or whatever. So that there are rules, but they're hidden to an outsider until they become part of the system. So, okay. Do I pass?
Great answer. Please share your questions, comments.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to stand up if that's okay, so I can see you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. You have brought very interesting points for us to think about. But with your book, it's just reminded me of another book, may or may not be in the same field, like the Battlefield of Tiger Mother.
Oh, yes.
When that book is first published, I think, like the Asian parents are kind of stereotyped as tiger mothers. So, from your experience in China and with talking with the teachers, do you find like tiger mothers yourself, or maybe do you feel the influence from parents in teaching?
There's certainly, Chinese parents who are sort of interested in kids getting education, which is a very strong drive, obviously. The tiger mother issue, because it's I don't know how many people have read that book or know about it. When I got to China after it had been published, I was basically attacked by people who said, by Chinese, who were furious at her. I mean, they're very, very angry that she was so extreme.
Yeah, yeah. I agree.
And so I think that's my read on how many Chinese I know felt about that book, that it was just so extreme that it gave them all a bad name. And that they would never do a number of the things that she did. Having said that, of course, Chinese parents, because there's so much pressure, are very, they have to stay on their children all the time and make sure they're doing their homework. And, there's just a much more pressure. There's pressure here, but there's much more pressure there, and it's so focused, and I think many of them are very frustrated. And this is, of course, varied across, there are many different responses, but certainly many of the parents are very frustrated at the narrowness of the education and would like to see much more chance for the kids to actually be able to ask a question or say what they think.
How much is American parents involved in education, in educating their kids? Like, they care about this, how good that kids made in the school, or they care about if they go to college or go to a good college or not? How much is that?
Well, because, I think this is true in both countries. We often talk about this, but it really, in terms of the middle class or the upper middle class who are pushing very hard to get their kids into colleges. But of course, there are many, many other people in the country too. So in the United States, I would say, and I work in the public schools, so that the drive for education is strong, but it's very different from in China, because in the elementary, there are many other, childhood is for many things. It's for education, but it's also for making friends, for playing soccer, for being in your church group, or whatever other things. And going to college is in the back of people's minds, but it's just not like it is in China at all. So I think childhood here is much more, all the way up through junior high, really. There's just much more interest in multiple interests. So, and getting a job, for instance, and knowing how to do a job, and all of those things that don't really play into the Chinese parents' perspective, because they need to pass that exam.
Everything happens after that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank
Exactly.
you.
Okay. I see a hand.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I should go. Hi,
Hi.
thank you for your speech. I'm a freshman from Yale College, and I just want to make a few
From which college?
Yale College.
Oh, from Yale.
Yeah,
I
I'm
thought you said your college. I
That would be so.
Our undergraduate college is mostly women. So.
Yeah, I see that from the name. So sorry. So I just want to make a few feedbacks myself because I'm really excited by your speech. I was born and bred in China, and I was always in the local educational system. So I was not in an international school, that's like American school or something.
Right.
I was always in the local education system, and what you said about Chinese education, elementary education, just everything, just exactly reminded me of my elementary school education, and precisely students sitting a row and teachers speaking in the front and different teachers coming up to teach different lectures. So I just really want to first thank you for this research, which I think is really, really thoughtful, and
Great.
I really appreciate this effort.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
for that first. And I just want to make this observation that because now that I'm in a US college, I'm really observing my learning pattern, how my learning pattern is different from my American classmates. And I want to add this new contribution that I just discovered this afternoon in my econ class, that so we're having this intro to microeconomics class, and in this class I discovered, because it's a small seminar, it's a seminar of 25 students, so you really can actually pose questions as long as you want. And as you see, I like asking questions. Sorry, I did not fall into the stereotype, but I like asking questions, and American students, classmates also like to ask questions, but the questions we ask are actually very different because I would ask questions that direct to the effective solving of this problem. Like I would suggest a different way to solve this more effectively, and I would suggest that will this method contribute to that thought? Like I would combine different concepts in economics within economics to effectively like study this subject. While my American classmates usually ask questions that seem to me at first glance really irrelevant. Like they would use their real life experience to say, well, while I was eating ice cream, I did not use this utility function and stuff. So I think that's so irrelevant to me at first glance. I think why are we asking this? But then later it dawned on me that their questions can actually contribute to a very new perspective in the subject, because in a subject like economics, it's a social science instead of like a hard science. I mean, like even if in hard sciences like physics, there can be like this random thoughts can really contribute to the new perspective in this. So I really enjoying like talking with classmates. Like I'm also in a writing seminar right now, and I choose to pair with American classmates who can contribute really, really random, irrelevant thoughts to my writing papers, to my papers. And because my inherent thinking pattern is to really effectively solve this question and to relate different ideas and concepts and
stay on the
formulas.
focus. Yeah, yeah.
I'm really focused.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want to make this observation. And so the question I want to ask is actually a quotation from my high school history teacher. My high school history teacher is very renowned in Beijing, in the city, and even nationwide. So there are a lot of seminars and lectures that he was invited to give about how he teaches students. Being in his class, I can tell that he really integrated shooting high score in exam and learning, like really stirring up students to think. And so he's like a perfect example of like how teachers should be like, a combination of US teacher and Chinese teacher. And he made this point in one of his seminars that is really revolutionary, like really shocking to people, that he says if a teacher says there's difficulty integrating helping students getting high score in exam and stirring up students' thoughts and free thinking, that would only say that this teacher is not knowledgeable and well studied, like he's not knowledgeable himself, like he's not good enough himself. He made this point, and I think it's very shocking at first glance. It's like all the students are, like all the teachers who wonder about this question are not good enough themselves. But when I think about it, I feel like, because in my primary school, my Chinese teacher really encouraged us to give our own answers to questions, and we can actually, as you said, we can actually build up our thoughts on each other's in class discussions. That is like not a typical Chinese class,
No, it's not.
and I do not think that our high school, like our primary school system, is fundamentally different from those of the primary schools in other like smaller cities or countryside. I do not think the system is fundamentally different, but the difference is that teachers in my primary high school, they usually got a degree from 2 years college or even 4 years college or even master's sometimes. Like, I feel like because they know about this thoughts and this, like, if they have been if they have read your book or been to this lecture today, they obviously know how to improve their teaching within the framework of the system. So it seems to me that your study has been focused exclusively on the two different systems of US and China system. But have you thought that maybe a very powerful way to change the situation does not solely lie on changing the system, but about training teachers, I mean both US and Chinese teachers,
Right.
let them to have more, because it seems to me that no one is discouraging a US teacher from teaching hard science principles in his class, and no one is stopping a Chinese class teacher from encouraging class discussions in her class. So it seems to me that teachers' capability itself is very important to the education experience overall. So I just want to ask this question
Right.
to you.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think, yeah, I focus on teachers more than systems, because systems are a little bit hard to deal with. People are much, I mean, if you're going to change something, it needs to be through teachers. And other institutions too, but teachers are certainly the key to that. I think one thing that sort of plays into your question, this isn't quite a direct answer, but is that there are really two very strong styles. And one of the things about cultural styles is that we don't know we have them. So our culture is sort of like the water the fish swims in. The fish doesn't know that he or she is actually in water until someone takes them out. And we don't know that we're inside of our own cultures because they're just so automatic to us. And one of the things that I've seen in sort of by analyzing a lot of lessons in both countries is that in China there's really a performance style of teaching. And it's the very, very good teachers from the Chinese perspective have this ability to ask questions of the students to sort of hone. They have a great deal of knowledge about the subject. That's step number one. And then they perfect, and with the help of their colleagues very often, perfect how to deliver that in the very best way, with this dynamic going back and forth between the teacher and the student, and the teacher and the student. I mean, it's very hard. I used to have an audio that I played, but when you travel around giving talks, you give up on audio and video very fast because they don't often work. So that's one thing, whereas in the United States, there really is this improvisational situation. And one thing that makes them different is that the Chinese teacher knows what the students are going to come to the class with because they have memorized, I mean, they know that text cold. And so the teacher can plan that lesson, and it can really be a performance, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's sort of a dance that happens, and very, very carefully crafted, but it's possible because they know what the students are coming with. Whereas the US teacher goes home and plans at night and plans this far, but has no idea what kind of these random questions students are going to ask or bring in, which can be extremely important. So the US teacher has to improvise responses just as the students are improvising responses, because the teacher has no idea. I mean, they know what the students are supposed to have read, but that doesn't mean that that's what they're going to, how they're going to respond to that, or what they didn't understand, or the questions they're going to ask, or the irrelevant suggestions they're going to make about whatever they did at the ice cream shop. Is the teacher has to improvise right there on how to interact. So actually, to have that kind of, I mean, they really are culturally bound systems in some ways, and we can share pieces of them. But we can never be the other person.
Yes, I totally agree.
So that doesn't quite answer your question, but it's sort of
Thank you very much.
underlying.
That's very helpful insight.
I'm going to do the Chinese way. My name is Lan. I'm a teacher. Also, I'm a mother of 3 children who go to elementary school. So I have 2 questions. One
They go to
is-
school here?
They go to school here. They were
Right.
born here.
Okay.
So my question number 1 is, what advice do you have that you think would improve the U.S. elementary school math education? I know there's pros and cons, but like you shared, the common is the kids coming with very strong knowledge, problem-solving skills in math, comparing the Chinese student and American student. That's my first question. And the second question, piggyback what you just said in China, because teachers are focused on one subject, so they really can do a lot of preparation, really be expert in each subject matter. While in American elementary school, if you have a teacher who's so passionate about writing, I'm sure the whole year, I know my child will have great time to write,
Right.
while the next year they have a teacher who has such a passion in science.
Right.
They'll have a great experience. So would you mind just comparing these two models? What do you think would be ideal in elementary school education in terms of a teacher teaches every subject, is thematic, it's
Yeah,
holistic,
yeah.
rather than in China, it's very like a specialized
Right,
subject.
right, yeah.
Thank you.
And that's a great question. Well, all the questions are great, but it's a fundamental question and something that I've sort of stewed about because there's no clear-cut answer. One of the advantages of a teacher in this country who teaches the students most of the time, and of course many of our schools have lopped off art and music and a number of other things, unfortunately, but is that our teachers know the students very well. And it is true that in China there is a class teacher who oversees them, but they seem not to have the subtlety of knowledge that a teacher who sort of taught all the different, when the teacher understands in the United States that this child is really strong in reading and needs more help in math and et cetera. So I think you don't want to lose that knowledge base that the teacher has, but at the same time, I think, this is purely my personal opinion, is that there needs to be more focus on perhaps specializing some so that our teachers have a chance to get that depth of information, of knowledge. And many of them have much more depth in the humanities than they have in math and science. Science basically doesn't exist in elementary school in any real sense. But to have them, if you sort of just look at math and how they could get that, they really need many more courses and much more knowledge about how to impart those concepts to children, which is done very, very well and thoroughly in China and not here. Even for those of our teachers who are very good in math, they don't necessarily know how to teach it so that kids get the basic concepts. It's not always easy. And especially in a culture, this culture, my husband's a scientist, and he just talks about the innumerate people in the United States every time he reads the paper. It is not a country that is comfortable mathematically. And so there's an enormous amount of knowledge that the teachers need, and they don't have the chance to get it. So I think it's a long haul, but I think the more they have education in mathematics, and then the discussions that are required to get to teaching it well is one step. I think someone was talking, Sharon Crane actually, about a project in Maine, which is involving all of the teachers, parents, staff, community people, in just talking about all of the needs of education and the fact that in both countries, we're talking about the systems as they are, but, they're changing very fast, and the technology world is going to change them dramatically soon, and we aren't, either one of us, ready for this. And so how do you deal with this blitz of knowledge, that's drowning us, and how do you have kids actually understand how to separate what's good information and what's not good information, and so there are a lot of things going on at once, and meanwhile we need to also work with the system we have and do it. So
Thank you.
okay, yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your interesting, inspiring talk. I'm a junior here, and I'm considering doing education PhD to further my studies.
You speak a little louder, the people behind you.
Oh, sorry. I'm a junior exchange student, and I'm considering doing education PhD. So I'm especially interested in the comparative international China and the U.S. Education. So this talk is really interesting. And I would like to ask the question about like how you do research on China, because I think like China and U.S. are both huge, and there are like obviously a lot of variety in educational resources and educational teaching and facilities. Like you pick up some rural in the slides you see some rural elementaries, but I feel like maybe in big cities the situations are different. Like how do you draw a precise picture to people from another to people from another culture to understand it, like without misconception, without
That's very hard.
Yeah, so like I would like to know
Right.
how you balance.
Yeah, did everyone hear it back there? Okay. How you balance being honest about what you're saying and what you're researching while also generalizing is very complicated. And it's true in research. I mean, even though you're trying to be very, I've done research for years, and trying to be very accurate, you always know that you're looking at this much of the world, and there are pieces of the world that you're not. I mean, as hard as you try to get a clear picture of that world, you know that it's not perfect at all. The other thing is that, especially talking between two countries, I mean, when I wrote this book, I knew I was leaving out tons of stuff. I mean, I have file drawers of material that it would be great in there, except nobody would read it. And, but, so you have to try to stay as honest as you can about things without confusing people. And that's very hard. And I'm not sure I could have done it 20 or 30 years ago. Because I've now had enough experience in both countries to sort of know what I can say that is pretty true. But I also know that there are exceptions all over the place. And one reason I show slides in both the country and the city is that, of course, in China, those are very dramatically different in a lot of situations. So what I have aimed at and what I talk about is sort of the middle. So I never go to key schools, for instance. It is very hard to get into poor schools. I have someone in Guangzhou who has promised to take me to a poor high school. But as a foreign visitor, that's very hard to do. But I never go to key schools because, just like I don't go to private schools here, or I don't go to the very privileged public schools here, because I know that's not where most of the kids go. They're exceptions. So that's the best answer I could do. And if you know, I have a card somewhere in my briefcase. Anyway, if you'd like to ask more questions.
Save your question directly for so much. There'll be more time to sit and informally and talk. We have a reception in the other room. But first of all, I want to give a gift to Dr. Pine.
I saw that sitting out there.
Pleasure and an honor to hear about this and over this this time span that you've been studying both the U.S. and China. Just to the point where we're all having these major questions. I want to remind people that we have another Fireside Chat coming up on let's see if I got the right date, Tuesday, October 29th. World Fellow, who's here as just for this semester, Xingzui Wang, who is Vice President for the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation, will be speaking right here. He will be speaking about poverty alleviation efforts in China and the role of NGOs. Later on, I think the following week, we will have Rachel Wasser, and Rachel actually is a former Yale-China teaching fellow who went on to found an organization called Teach for China, which also sends American teachers and pairs them with Chinese teachers to teach in rural schools in China. So we have a lot to talk with her about, and that's on November 7th. Also, if any of you have any interest in volunteering for us at Yale-China, we are looking for volunteers. McGee, who's behind our tiny little flip camera, is happy to discuss the opportunities we have. So please talk to her. And we'll have our drawing. One of you is going to win the translator. So let's see who it is. Oh, let's see. Doctor, would you please reach in and put, why not?
For our lucky draw.
Let's see. I don't know how this works. Yes, a number.
No, this one.
That's a number.
Yeah.
It's a number. All of us who need to, all of our Americans who are challenged with numbers. 236052.
We have 5-2.
5-2.
So 052. Yeah. Okay. And we have a reception. We have some food and drink, and I hope Dr. Fine is here to continue the conversation. So thank you so much for coming today.
You have books for sale?
And books are for sale, and I think you're happy to sign them as well. Yes. Yeah.